Elsewhere now, the European Union Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell is warning that a ground operation in Rafah by Israeli forces must be avoided. Speaking at the plenary session of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, France, Mr. Borrell indicated that the humanitarian consequences in Rafah could be catastrophic, an area where more than 1.3 million civilians are sheltering. He also welcomed Israel's decision to open more aid routes to Gaza, urging the immediate access of humanitarian supplies to the besieged strip.
We need more access by land roads, more access points. The recent decision by Israel to open the Ashdod port and the Erez crossing points are positive news, but they have to be implemented. It's not a matter of announcing, it's a matter of doing. And by the time being, it's doing in a very slow pace and very low quantity. A ground operation in Rafah must be avoided. There are more than 1.3 million people on the streets of Rafah without no more shelter than a piece of plastic over their heads. And humanitarian consequences would be catastrophic. It is an irreplaceable safe line for hundreds of thousands of people, calling the international community to fund UNRWA in order to make this institution to continue their work. I have to pay tribute to the 7 humanitarian workers killed when they were working for the World Central Kitchen, but also to the 249 people who were killed before. I have to pay tribute to all the victims of the Hamas attack and the Israeli army against Gaza, to more than 100 journalists and media reporters, and we have to ask for this tragedy to end. And we cannot say this is just a humanitarian problem. It is, and it has to be immediately faced. But it is a political problem. And we have to join our forces, as we agreed to do yesterday with the Gulf countries, in order to look for a political solution that can only be based, I believe, we believe at the European Union, on the two-state solution. And we condemn all terrorist activities, but we want humanitarian law being respected. And we want the hostilities to stop, humanitarian support to come in, the hostages being released, and a political process to put in place in order to look for a political solution to this dramatic war.
Meanwhile, the United Nations Human Rights Chief Volker Turk has condemned Israeli strikes in Rafah that has left mostly children and women killed. This was relayed by spokesperson of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ravina Shamdasani. Mr. Turk also called an independent investigation following reports of mass graves in Gaza's Nasser hospital complex. According to Palestinian officials, 35 bodies had been recovered from the mass graves outside of the hospital, bringing the total number of bodies found at the site to 283. Israel's military said claims that it buried bodies there were baseless.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights today decried a series of Israeli strikes on Gaza in the past few days that have killed mostly children and women. He repeats his warning against a full-scale incursion on an area where 1.2 million civilians have already been forcibly cornered. Such an operation would lead to further breaches of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and risks even more deaths, injuries, and displacement on a large scale. Even further atrocity crimes, for which those responsible must be held accountable. The latest images of a premature child who was taken from the womb of her dying mother, of the adjacent 2 houses where 15 children and 5 women were killed. This is beyond warfare. This is something that struck me as a woman, as a mother. The the premature child who was delivered from the dying mother's womb, it really struck me, really affected me. And then I looked at what UNFPA had said. An estimated 180 women are giving birth every day in Gaza in inhumane, unimaginable conditions. Now, this woman was dying when the premature baby was taken out. There are women who are 180 women giving birth every day, many probably through cesarean sections, without anesthesia, in inhumane, deplorable conditions, not knowing whether their child will survive, not knowing whether they will survive. We are horrified also by the destruction of An-Nasser Medical Complex and Al-Shifa Medical Complex, and the reports of the discovery of mass graves in and around facilities. And we call for independent, effective, transparent investigations into the deaths. Given the prevailing climate of impunity, this should include international investigators. Hospitals are entitled to very special protection under international humanitarian law. And let's be clear, the intentional killing of civilians, detainees, and others who are hors de combat is a war crime.
Egyptian authorities have arrested activists at a protest held in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. Protesters gathered outside the regional office of the UN Women Agency in Cairo to call for the protection of women in Gaza. Officials say at least 18 activists, mostly women, were detained when police broke up the protest. Although Egypt's government has condemned Israel's campaign in Gaza, it has largely banned public demonstrations against the war. Well, pro-Gaza protests are holding in some of America's universities, but those at Columbia University are vowing to continue the protests until their demands are met. The protests have, however, turned violent here. More than 100 students were arrested at a protest encampment last week, followed by dozens more at the Yale and New York University in recent days. Many at Columbia have been suspended, prompting vocal calls for disciplinary measures to be dropped or rescinded. A deadline that was given by the university on Tuesday for protesters to disband by midnight has now been extended by 48 hours, with officials reporting important progress in talks to reach a deal. Similar encampments have sprung up at universities across the U.S., including the University of California, Berkeley, Yale, Emerson, and the University of Michigan. Since last week, protesters at Columbia, partly organized by a group called Columbia University Apartheid Divest, have called on the university to fully divest its finances, including its endowment, from companies and institutions it claims profit from Israel's occupation of Palestinians.
This is like taking to extreme measures to try to infringe our First Amendment right and silence us and scare us to stop talking about what's going on, and we're not going to stop, because until our demands are met, we're going to continue organizing and to continue talking about this. Students across the nation have answered their calls and have started organizing even more actions in solidarity with the students in Columbia for calling for the freedom Palestinians, for calling to an end to the genocide of the Palestinian people, and an end for the complicity of our universities in the ongoing genocide.
The Jewish students here on campus have already had to deal with a lot, and what's happening at Columbia is extremely negative and anti-Semitic, and it's making an unsafe environment for the Jewish people, the Jewish students there.